As class began, Mrs. Miller's voice filled the room, sharp, precise, every syllable clipped like a blade. She lectured on literary devices, her chalk tapping impatiently against the board as she spoke. Cameron tried to focus, taking notes diligently, but every so often she felt the teacher's gaze flick in her direction, heavy and pointed. It wasn't just today. It had started weeks ago, subtle at first, a dismissive tone when calling on her, a cold glance when she answered correctly, small comments, veiled under professional language, but cutting all the same. Then came the moment. They were halfway, through analyzing a poem when Mrs. Miller paused, looking up from the textbook, her eyes narrowing as they settled on Cameron. "Miss Norris," she said crisply, making the entire class turn. Cameron's stomach tightened. "Yes, ma'am. You seem rather distracted today," Mrs. Miller said. "Or is it that you believe you've already mastered the material?" A few students glanced at one another, awkward tension thickening the air. "I'm paying attention," Cameron answered quietly. Mrs. Miller smiled then, not kindly but thinly, the corners of her mouth lifting without reaching her eyes. "Of course, I imagine it's hard to focus when you walk around with a name like yours." There was a pause, sharp and uncomfortable, before Mrs. Miller turned back to the chalkboard as though nothing had happened. The class pretended not to notice. Cameron stared at her notebook, her throat tight, her pen motionless. The bell rang soon after, releasing them all, but the comment clung to her like a shadow. The day rolled on in a haze. At lunch, Emily noticed something was off, but Cameron brushed her concern away. She didn't want to explain, didn't want to sound like she was making excuses. The afternoon classes passed without incident, but the words from English class looped in her mind like a broken record. That evening, back home, Cameron sat at the dinner table, her appetite dulled. Gina chatted lightly about the day. Chuck asked about her classes, but Cameron offered only vague answers, forcing smiles and nods. She didn't mention Mrs. Miller or the sharpness of her words. After dinner, she and her father trained in the backyard. The cool evening air felt good on her skin as they moved through their drills. Cameron found comfort in the rhythm, the focus, the control, the silence between breaths. "You're distracted," Chuck noted gently after a while, lowering his stance. Cameron shrugged. "Just school stuff." He studied her quietly but didn't press. Instead, he showed her a new block combination, and for a while, the knot in her chest loosened. Later that night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Cameron wondered why Mrs. Miller disliked her so much. She had never misbehaved, never shown off. She worked hard, kept her head down, did everything she was supposed to do. But it didn't seem to matter. The next day the pattern repeated itself, and the next. The comments were never outright cruel, just small, cutting, dressed up in professionalism. "She thinks she's special. Fame doesn't mean intelligence. We follow rules in this classroom, no matter who your father is." Each time, Cameron felt herself shrinking a little more, her voice quieter, her posture smaller. She stopped raising her hand and stopped volunteering answers. She laughed less at lunch and spent more time buried in her notebook. Gina noticed. One evening, as Cameron sat silently at the dinner table, her mother reached across and gently touched her hand. "Is everything okay at school, sweetheart?" Cameron hesitated, her throat tightening around the words. She wanted to tell her, but something kept her silent, a fear of sounding weak, of making something out of nothing. "It's fine," she said quietly. Her mother didn't press, but her gaze lingered a moment longer than usual. That night, Cameron stared at herself in the mirror once again. Her long hair framed her face, a soft curtain that felt like armor. She brushed it slowly, methodically, her eyes meeting her own in the reflection. Tomorrow will be another day walking in the shadow of her name, another day trying not to crumble beneath it. The days that followed blurred into one another like pages in a book she no longer wanted to read. For Cameron Norris, each morning felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of invisible eyes followed her from the moment she left her house, until she returned at the end of the day. It wasn't just the comments anymore. It was the spaces between them, the silence charged with something sharp and sour, the glances from her classmates that lingered a little too long, the whispers that faded as she passed. At home, everything remained the same. Her mother's warm voice, her father's calm presence, the clatter of dishes at dinner, the rhythm of her karate training sessions in the backyard. It should have been enough to ground her, to remind her of who she was. But somewhere between the walls of her school and the four corners of Mrs. Miller's classroom, something inside her had begun to bend. The comments had grown subtler but more frequent. Mrs. Miller had perfected the art of the veiled insult, delivering it with such practiced ease that anyone who wasn't paying close attention might have missed the venom in her tone. A question posed to Cameron was always sharper, always loaded. When she answered correctly, the praise was laced with surprise, as though intelligence was something unexpected in her. When she stumbled, the disapproval felt heavier than it should have. It was in the way Mrs. Miller's eyes lingered on her hair when she thought no one was looking, the way her lips pressed into a thin line when Cameron spoke. It was in the tiny, calculated remarks how fortunate she was to have the advantage of a famous father, how easy life must be when people open doors for you. And the others were beginning to notice. Some of her classmates still smiled at her in the hallways, but many had grown distant, watching her with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort, as though afraid to stand too close. A few had begun echoing Mrs. Miller's tone, parroting her words, like children seeking approval. She thinks she's better than us. She only gets attention because of who her dad is. The words chased Cameron through the hallways like shadows, slipping under her skin. It wasn't that she didn't try to ignore it. She had always been taught to rise above, to be stronger than the noise around her. But there was something relentless about the way it chipped away at her, day after day, like water wearing down stone. Her friends, Emily and Ryan, noticed the change in her. One afternoon at lunch, Emily slid onto the bench beside her, her tray clattering lightly against the table. "You've been quiet lately," Emily said, her voice careful. Cameron shrugged, poking at the food on her tray without much interest. "Just school." Ryan, sitting across from them, exchanged a glance with Emily. "It's Mrs. Miller, isn't it?" Cameron's eyes flicked up, surprised. She hadn't realized it was that obvious. "She's hard on everyone," she said, though the words felt like a lie even as she spoke them. Emily frowned. "No, she's hard on you." Cameron didn't answer. She didn't know how to. What was she supposed to say? That every day felt like walking a tightrope, waiting for the next time Mrs. Miller would knock her off balance. That week, the tension in English class ratcheted higher. It began with the literary contest. The announcement had been made during homeroom. An upcoming writing competition open to all students. The theme was resilience. Cameron had barely paid attention until Mrs. Miller mentioned it in class, her eyes scanning the room before settling deliberately on Cameron. "Well," Mrs. Miller said, her voice light but edged, "some of you might think you've already experienced enough to write on the subject, but resilience isn't inherited, Miss Norris. It's earned." The room had gone quiet. Cameron stared down at her desk, the comment echoing in her ears. Despite herself, she submitted an essay. Writing had always been something she enjoyed, a way to make sense of the world when it felt too heavy. She didn't expect anything to come of it, but a week later the results were announced. Her essay had been selected among the finalists. The recognition should have felt good. Instead, it felt like a trap. Mrs. Miller didn't hide her displeasure. On the day the finalists were posted, Mrs. Miller handed back the class's essays with a tight smile. "I suppose it helps to have a last Name that opens doors, she remarked casually as she placed Cameron's paper on her desk. The words hit harder than they should have. Cameron kept her eyes fixed on the desk, her fingers curling into fists beneath it. It wasn't long after that the comments shifted. Mrs. Miller began mentioning the school dress code more frequently, almost exclusively when Cameron entered the room. Her gaze always lingered on Cameron's long hair, the way it fell in soft waves past her shoulders. One afternoon, as the class packed up at the end of the period, Mrs. Miller's voice cut through the chatter. "Miss Norris, a word." Cameron's stomach dropped. She waited until the others had filed out, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her fingers tightening around the strap. Mrs. Miller didn't look up from the papers she was shuffling. "I've noticed your hair has gotten rather long," she said, her tone conversational. But there was something pointed beneath it. "You're aware of the school's grooming policy, I assume?" Cameron nodded, unsure where this was going. Her hair had never been an issue before. "I would hate for it to become a distraction in class," Mrs. Miller continued, finally meeting her gaze, "for you or for others." Cameron swallowed. I didn't think Mrs. Miller smiled then, but it wasn't kind. "Of course you didn't." The conversation ended there, but the unease lingered long after Cameron left the classroom. Over the next few days, the comments kept coming. "It's important to follow the rules. No one is above the dress code." Discipline applies to everyone, always directed at her, always in front of the class. Her friends noticed. Emily shot her worried glances. Ryan asked if she wanted to tell the principal. Cameron shook her head each time. She didn't want to make a scene, she didn't want to cause trouble, but the dread settled deeper in her stomach. Each day, a slow, gnawing thing she couldn't shake. At home, she said nothing. Her mother continued to ask how school was, her father asked about her classes, and Cameron gave them the same quiet answers she always did. She didn't want them to worry, she didn't want her father to know. It wasn't until the afternoon she overheard Mrs. Miller speaking in the hallway that something inside her shifted. She had stayed after class to ask another teacher a question, and as she turned the corner to head toward the exit, she heard her English teacher's voice. "She thinks the world owes her something because of her last name," Mrs. Miller was saying, her voice sharp, laced with something bitter. "Someone needs to teach that girl she's not special." Cameron stopped in her tracks, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. The words weren't said to her, but they felt like a slap nonetheless. She walked home that day with her shoulders hunched, her backpack heavier than usual. That night, she stood in front of her bedroom mirror again, staring at her reflection. Her long hair framed her face, softening the sharp angles of her cheekbones, hiding the tension in her eyes. She reached up, gathering the strands in her hands. She didn't feel special. She felt small, alone, trapped. The next day, she would step into Mrs. Miller's classroom again, and something would finally break. The morning unfolded like any other, but for Cameron Norris, the air felt heavier, charged with an electricity she couldn't name. She moved through her routine mechanically, brushing her hair in long, even strokes, her eyes fixed on her reflection without really seeing it. Her fingers lingered at the ends of her hair, twisting the strands absently, her stomach turning with a nod of quiet dread. She didn't want to go to school. She hadn't wanted to for weeks now, but today the feeling was worse. A sense of something inevitable waiting for her beyond the front door. She couldn't explain it, but the weight of the last few weeks, the pointed remarks, the looks, the constant simmering disapproval pressed down on her chest like a stone. Downstairs, her mother's voice called her to breakfast, the sound warm and normal, as if nothing had changed. Her father's chair scraped against the kitchen floor, the faint hum of the morning news playing in the background. Everything about her home life remained untouched, steady, like an island in the middle of the storm she couldn't seem to escape. Cameron forced herself to eat, exchanging quiet words with her parents, her smile tight but convincing. "Neither of ye." Them asked if anything was wrong. She had become too good at hiding it. The bus ride to school passed in a blur of engine hum and distant conversations. She stared out the window, watching the streets roll by, her reflection faint in the glass. A girl who looked calm, composed, but felt anything but. By the time she stepped through the school gates, her body felt tense, her skin prickling with anticipation. In her first 2 classes, she kept her head down, moving through the motions of the day, but her thoughts circled relentlessly around what awaited her in 3rd period. English. The bell rang and Cameron gathered her things, her heart thudding heavily in her chest as she walked down the hallway. She could already feel the way her steps slowed as she neared the classroom door, the way her fingers tightened around her notebook. Mrs. Miller was already there, standing at her desk, her posture rigid, her eyes sharp as they scanned the students filing in. Cameron slipped into her usual seat by the window, her pulse fluttering in her throat. The classroom settled into a hush as the bell rang, students pulling out notebooks and pens, murmurs fading beneath the scrape of chairs. Mrs. Miller began the lesson. Her voice crisp, controlled, cutting through the air like a blade. Cameron tried to focus, her pen moving mechanically across the page, but her mind buzzed, her stomach twisted. She could feel Mrs. Miller's eyes flick toward her more often than usual, her expression unreadable. The lecture moved on, the minutes ticking by like stones falling one by one into a deep well, and then, without warning, the moment came. Mrs. Miller closed the textbook with a quiet snap, her gaze lifting to scan the room. "Everyone, pack up your things," she announced. "You're dismissed for lunch." The students exchanged surprised glances, some murmuring in confusion. The bell hasn't rung yet, but no one questioned it. One by one, they gathered their belongings, shuffling toward the door. Cameron was halfway through stuffing her notebook into her backpack when Mrs. Miller's voice sliced through the noise. "Ms. Norris stayed behind." Her hands froze. The other students glanced at her, some curious, others sympathetic. Emily shot her a worried look as she passed, but Cameron managed a small, tight smile in return. When the last student filed out and the door clicked shut behind them, the room seemed to grow colder, quieter. Cameron stood beside her desk, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her heart hammering so loudly she could hear it in her ears. "Mrs. Tai." Miller moved from behind her desk, walking slowly toward Cameron, her heels clicking softly against the linoleum floor. "You and I need to have a conversation," she said, her voice measured, almost pleasant. Cameron nodded silently, unsure what to say. Mrs. Miller stopped in front of her, folding her arms. "I've been patient," she began, her gaze cool. "But it seems you still haven't understood what this classroom is about." Cameron blinked, her brow furrowing in confusion. "I don't understand," she said quietly. Mrs. Miller's lips curved into a thin smile. "No, I don't imagine you do," she replied. "You walk in here every day with that hair falling over your shoulders, drawing attention to yourself, acting as if the rules don't apply to you." Cameron's stomach twisted. "I'm not," she began, but Mrs. Miller held up a hand, cutting her off. "You're not what? Trying to stand out?" Mrs. Miller's eyes narrowed. "Then why is it that you insist on ignoring the dress code? Why is it that every time you step into this room you bring your father's name with you like a shield?" Cameron's throat tightened. "I didn't mean—" Mrs. Miller moved past her, heading toward her desk. "Enough," she said sharply. "I've spoken to you about this before, I've warned you. And since you seem unwilling to correct the problem yourself—" She reached into her desk drawer, pulling something out. Cameron's heart stopped when she saw the scissors. A simple, ordinary pair of classroom scissors. But in Mrs. Miller's hand, they felt like something far more dangerous. Cameron's pulse raced, her mouth going dry. "Sit down," Mrs. Miller ordered, her tone leaving no room for argument. Cameron stood frozen, her feet rooted to the spot, I said, sit down. There was a sharpness in the teacher's voice that made Cameron's legs move before her brain could catch up. She lowered herself into the chair at her desk, her backpack slipping from her shoulder to the floor. Mrs. Miller approached, the scissors gleaming in her hand. I'm going to help you, she said quietly, almost gently. I'm going to teach you that the rules apply to everyone. Cameron's breath came fast, shallow. You can't, she started, her voice cracking. Mrs. Miller's smile didn't reach her eyes. I can. Without another word, she reached out, her fingers curling around a thick lock of Cameron's hair. Cameron flinched, her hands gripping the edge of her desk. The sound of the scissors cutting through her hair was soft, almost unremarkable. But to Cameron it felt deafening, a sharp slicing sound that echoed in her skull. The first strand fell to the floor, then another, and another. Her long, carefully brushed hair tumbled in uneven clumps onto the linoleum, each snip of the scissors slicing deeper than flesh. Cameron stared straight ahead, her face numb, her fingers white-knuckled against the desk. It felt like a dream, or a nightmare, or something far worse, something real. When Mrs. Miller finally stepped back, her breath came fast, her expression tight with something Cameron couldn't name. Satisfaction, perhaps, or something darker. There, she said quietly, now you look like everyone else. Cameron's eyes remained fixed on the front of the classroom, her face a blank canvas, her throat felt raw, her chest hollow. Mrs. Miller dropped the scissors back onto her desk with a quiet clatter. You're dismissed, she said. Cameron stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. She scooped up her backpack without looking at the floor, without looking at the hair that lay scattered around her feet like fallen leaves. Her eyes burned, but she refused to let the tears fall. Not here, not yet. She walked out of the classroom in a daze, her steps wooden, her breath coming in shallow bursts. She made it down the hallway, through the front doors, across the parking lot. It wasn't until she was half a block from the school that the tears finally came. They feel hot and fast, blurring her vision, her breath hitching in her chest as she ducked her head, pulling her hood up to hide the jagged remnants of her hair. She didn't stop walking. She didn't stop until she reached the front steps of her house, her fingers trembling as she fumbled with the key. When she stepped inside, the quiet of home wrapped around her like a blanket, soft and suffocating. Her mother called from the kitchen, but Cameron didn't answer. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step heavier than the last, and closed her bedroom door behind her. In front of the mirror, she finally looked. The reflection that stared back at her didn't feel like hers. Her hair was uneven, chopped short, in some places, longer in others. The strands ragged where the scissors had torn through them. She ran a shaken hand through the mess, her fingers catching on the uneven edges. Her throat tightened, a sob threatening to escape. She bit it back. Somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the humiliation, beneath the grief, something else took root. It was small and bitter and sharp. Anger. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. The house was silent when Cameron finally emerged from her bedroom hours later. The sky outside had darkened, the soft hues of dusk bleeding into the corners of the windows, like watercolor. She had spent the afternoon curled up beneath her blankets, her body tense and cold, her throat raw from the effort of holding back tears. She hadn't wanted to move, hadn't wanted to face her parents, hadn't wanted to speak, but the weight of what had happened pressed heavier than the covers over her. It wouldn't let her hide forever. When she finally crept downstairs, her footsteps, quiet on the carpeted stairs, she heard the low murmur of voices in the kitchen, the steady hum of her father's voice, her mother's lighter tone responding. The ordinary cadence of their conversation felt surreal, like the world had kept turning while hers had stopped. Her mother looked up first when Cameron appeared in the doorway, her smile faltering the moment she saw her daughter's face. Gina's eyes softened immediately, the way a mother's eyes do when they know instinctively that something is very, very wrong. Chuck glanced over his shoulder. A spoon paused mid-air and frowned. Cameron hesitated, her hand tightening around the strap of her sweatshirt. "Sweetheart," Gina said quietly, crossing the kitchen in a few quick steps. "What's wrong?" For a moment, Cameron couldn't find her voice. The knot in her throat tightened, her breath shallow. Then, without meaning to, she lifted her hand and tugged down the hood of her sweatshirt. The silence that followed was deafening. Gina's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in shock as she took in the jagged, uneven remnants of Cameron's hair. Chuck's brow furrowed deeply, his entire body stilling as he stared at his daughter. Neither of them spoke. Cameron swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on the floor, her voice barely audible when she finally spoke. "She cut it," she whispered, "Mrs. Miller." For a long, breathless moment, the words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Then, Chuck's chair scraped back sharply against the tile floor. He crossed the room in 2 strides, crouching in front of his daughter, his hands gently taking her shoulders, his eyes scanning her face, the uneven locks of hair framing it. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low but vibrating with something dangerous beneath the surface. Cameron shook her head, her throat tight. "She said I wasn't following the dress code," she managed. "She said I thought I was special. And then she made me stay after class. She had scissors," her voice broke. Gina's hand rested on her back, rubbing small circles between her shoulder blades. But Cameron barely felt it. Chuck stood slowly, his jaw tight, his eyes darkening in a way Cameron had rarely seen. He didn't yell, he didn't curse, he didn't say anything at all for a long moment, and that silence felt heavier than any explosion. Then, with deliberate calm, he pulled out a chair for Cameron. "Sit," he said quietly. She did. He walked to the counter, picked up his phone, and